Like, what's the best way to begin to really cherish our spouse? Hi, I'm Greg Smalley, and I give leadership to the marriage department here at Focus on the Family. And I've got an amazing guest. This is a great friend. So you know Gary Thomas, author. He's one of the speaking pastors at Cherry Hills out here in Denver, Colorado. So now I live in the Springs, so we're neighbors. And so today we're just going to talk about your book, Cherishing. And I love this concept of cherishing. But I imagine, though, most of us said that phrase to love, honor, and cherish one another in our wedding vows. Great verse in Ephesians 5:29 that talks about cherishing and nourishing our wife especially. So maybe, Gary, let's start with what do you mean exactly by that phrase, cherishing?
For a couple of decades, I just focused on love, which is important and key. I don't want to diminish love at all, but love, you think of sacrifice, commitment, hanging in there, loyalty. That's essential to every marriage. I would say it is the foundation. But God did challenge me, and I remembered these vows. I promised to love and to cherish until death do us part. And I don't know that I ever thought of it again.
Yeah, like breaking those two out.
Yeah, Madonna had a song in the 80s. I wasn't a big Madonna fan, so I didn't give it much
We'll get into that
thought.
a little bit later.
But I felt like God was challenging me. Find out what that means. Put it into practice. See what happens. And it was a great discovery. One of the big differences is that love focuses me on my obligations, serving, sacrificing, hanging in. Again, that's all key. Yeah. Cherish focuses on the beauty and the excellence of my spouse. How do I train my mind to hold her up in excellence, to think of the best? So it's not just I'm in it because I have to be, but I cherish who you are. I want to show you off to the world. And I think it creates an entirely different experience for the spouse.
Yeah, because in a lot of ways, the more I cherish my wife, Erin, and she experiences that and sees that I get her value in all of who she is, who God's made her to be, there's a way in which that feels safe to her. She's probably more willing to be open, maybe more willing to be seen
100%.
By me. I love in that verse, Ephesians 5:29, how cherish is being used. The Greek meaning of that word is to warm. So you think like this, Colorado, cold nights, we're by a fire. And there's just a way in which we lean into what is warming us. And I think that's what you're saying, is that someone who's feeling cherished is going to respond probably by leaning in to that. So what are some ways that you encourage people to cherish? So to turn that into here's some actions behind that. What does that look like?
One, it changes the way we think about our spouse. There's that old phrase, familiarity breeds contempt, which could be death to a marriage. And you and I have seen that.
Yeah.
Me as a pastoral counselor, you as a real counselor. You see where contempt really starts to color everything the person does, and they look at it through a negative lens. I think we have to push back against that by choosing to cherish our spouse. One of the ways I recommend doing that is to look at our spouse as Adam or Eve, the only man or woman in the world. And that was a great place to cherish, because there was literally no woman that Adam could compare Eve to.
Right.
She defined for him what a woman is and what a woman is supposed to be. He couldn't think, well, she's athletic, but she's not as smart as this one, or social. For all he knew, this is a woman. This is who I have. And Adam represented the only man in the world. She couldn't say, well, he's a good athlete, but he's terrible as a handyman. He wouldn't know an emotion if it bit him on the nose until he bled. I mean, Adam was what she thought a man was supposed to be. Now, why is that so important? When we compare our spouse, we tend to compare their weaknesses to another spouse's strengths, of friends that you know, or someone else at church or whatnot.
Kind of what we do via social media. We see the best, we long for that,
And it never makes us feel better about our spouse. It makes our spouse feel insecure, because even if we're not verbalizing it, they're picking up and they know the light in our eyes, kind of, just that we have those little nonverbal tics if we're negatively comparing them that leads to contempt. Well, that means the spouse doesn't feel safe. The spouse doesn't feel valued. They're going to start to put their guard up. And so when I think of my wife as Eve, the only woman in the world, she doesn't have to live up to any other woman. On the day I get married, I have to make a commitment to contentment. I chose her. It's fine to evaluate, and you should evaluate somebody before you get married. Once they get married, they're your Eve. He's your Adam. You learn to appreciate them for who they are. Song of Songs 6:9 is a powerful verse for husbands. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one. And that's what every woman wants. She doesn't want to be compared to how other women look or how other women act, or maybe she doesn't feel as relational as other women, or she doesn't earn as much money, or she doesn't have this kind of personality. It's that sense of my husband chose me, and it's not just that he made a promise and so he can't leave me. He cherishes me for who I am. It's what every woman wants. And what hit me, Greg, is when I realized if I don't cherish my wife, she'll never know what it means to be cherished. That was sobering, because I think of the commitment she made. Out of billions of men on the earth, she's going to live this life with me.
Yeah, she picked you.
And I don't want to make her pay for it. I'd rather she benefit from that. And cherishing is one way. So we've got to change the way we think, that we focus on Adam and Eve, the only man or woman in the world. And then there are a lot of practices and attitudes I've found that we can do. One, I like the idea of showcasing. If you cherish something, you want to show it off.
Yeah,
a young woman gets engaged and she walks around with her hand like that, so everybody sees the wedding ring. A guy falls in love with his car and he's putting pictures on Facebook. Look at my new baby or whatnot. So if I cherish my wife, I don't want to just appreciate her excellence. I want others to appreciate it. I'm looking for ways to show her off. I talk about how God did this with Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16. Jerusalem, one of the most famous cities in the history of the world. But there was a time when Ezekiel's writing where Jerusalem was nothing. It was a pile of rocks. Jerusalem became famous because God chose her. And the language...
Esteemed her.
Yes. The language Ezekiel uses is that even your mother or father didn't want you. You were like a child left to die out in the desert. But God breathed life into you. He said, I want you to live. And then he adorned her. He cherished her with the richest foods and clothing and all of that. And that process of being cherished, Jerusalem became stunning, beautiful, a regal queen. And I like to tell husbands and wives when they're frustrated with their spouse, you don't know what your spouse can become until they've been cherished.
Yeah.
There's something about being cherished that makes you have more confidence to step out in the world, to become who God created you to be. If you feel like you're being undercut at home and you're trying to prove yourself, it usually creates the opposite effect. You're playing it safe or whatnot. When a husband can go up to a wife, you have such an understanding of Scripture. I really think you could teach this study. I don't know. No, seriously. I've been so challenged and blessed by what you say. Or, man, you're such a good mom. I say, really? Because they say I'm the worst mom in the world. No, I'm watching you. Trust me. I wish I could be half the parent you were. Just those kind of common things, whatever your spouse is into, where you're really affirming them and cherishing them, and then you want others to see it. It just creates a different dynamic in the relationship.
It's powerful. You think of like a Gideon who is the angel came to Gideon and kept calling him a mighty warrior. And this
What
is
do you mean?
right. It's like, I'm the weakest of the weakest
I'm the youngest
of the weak.
of the smallest clan and the smallest tribe. And
he kept
that's
saying
exactly
that, right?
the case.
Spoke that
Right.
into existence, called that out of Gideon. Same way that you're saying, we have that opportunity to call those things that we see that are true that maybe our spouse doesn't see. I remember as a young husband being at a dinner party to where this guy had been married 50 some years. We were just talking and I said, give me a tip. I've been married 6 months. So he kind of sits back and thinks about it and he goes, well, okay, here's one. He goes, I never let my wife leave our house without first complimenting her because I don't want the first compliment that she hears to come from another man. And I've loved that idea because same thing for me and Aaron. I don't want that to be a hole in her heart to where she's longing to have that sort of validation or just encouragement really from me.
Yeah.
And to me, that's one way that I try to cherish her is to notice those things, call those out, speak that kind of language, that compliment into her.
And I don't think that is sort of like extra credit. I think that's essential to cherish our spouse because I do think contempt is a default position.
Right.
We live in a fallen world. We're fallen people. Yeah. We've got to be honest. I'm not always lovable. Scripture says we all stumble in many ways.
We don't believe that for a moment.
And so if we're going to cherish an imperfect person, you've got to fight back on contempt or it leaks in. I'll never forget a dinner party with a couple. Lisa and I had been at their wedding and we're at a dinner party maybe 15 years later, enough time for contempt to set in. And he's very much an introvert. He won't engage much. And something came up where I thought he might have an opinion, just trying to be polite and pulling people out. Yeah. So I look at him and I say, don't chefs think such and such? And his wife cuts in and says, he's not a chef, he's a cook. Ooh. And her husband says, honey, he can call me a chef. No, he can't. Chefs prepare things. You just heat things up.
Whoa. Now, talk about awkward. You're like, okay.
Well, here's what he does.
Dessert, anyone? Yeah.
He's the head, I would say, chef at a nursing home, about 200 residents. And nursing homes are a tough business model these days. They do cut the budget. And so, some meals get heated up. But he really does try his best to do. And where I think it's such a Christian occupation is that James tells us that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this. Look after orphans and widows in their distress, right? So here you have a demographic, a lot of widows, often just scuttled away. And their high point might be lunch and dinner or breakfast or dessert or something like that. And I would think a Christian wife might say, honey, I'm going to pray for you like just as Jesus fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fish. If you have a cut budget, you're going to find out a way to really feed into them. Instead, she was clearly concerned that I might cause the entire table to give her husband more respect than she thinks he deserved. And I just, you and I probably do this because we speak and we write. I'm just thinking, to what end? On the way home, is she thinking they're going to have a great time? Oh, honey, wasn't that wonderful? Yeah. Or is he going to be completely silent as he was for the rest of the dinner?
Marginalize me to a cook or whatever.
Then when they get home, here, honey, let me give you a back rub. I know it's been a long night. Or is he just going to have him be hurt? Go. I just thought, where did that contempt come from? She knew what he did when they got married. And as an objective observer, I believe it's a profession, especially as a Christian, that you can celebrate and affirm. And she had it with contempt. She held it with contempt. And so I think contempt, they talk about rose-colored glasses. What do you call this? Brown-colored glasses or contempt-colored glasses?
Dark colored something, yeah.
And so when I'm working with a couple and I've noticed the contempt is up there, one of the things I've tried to do, and I did this for myself, I did a daily notebook. Every day I would write down something specific Lisa had done the day before or something I appreciated about her. It was significant to every day. And I made a commitment. I'm not going to start work. I'm not going to go for a run. I'm not going to do anything until I fill in this book. And so for a year, it was going to be her Christmas present. For a year, the first thought I'm going to have is, God, what can I thank you for about my wife? What can I celebrate you for creating my wife? And you go through 30 days, 60 days. You don't want to keep putting the same thing.
Right.
So after about 3 months, I'm really having to start looking at her throughout the day to catch her doing something. Oh, I'm going to write about that. So I'm literally training my brain, ignore the frustrations because you're not going to write that down.
Notice the good.
Catch her doing something that is noteworthy and remind yourself of what she's doing. Greg, it changed the way I thought about her, talked to her, and even prayed about her. It's hard to ask God to change your spouse when he can point to this book. You've just written 167 great things about her, 167 days in a row, and you're upset because this one thing is frustrating. And I gave it to her as one of her Christmas gifts. And I made her cry at Christmas for good reasons. And
That's powerful.
what I'm doing is I just would ask the husbands listening or watching, what do you think it does to a man when his first thought every day is to think about the excellence of his spouse or not taking it for granted? This is something specific you did that I really appreciate. I was training my brain to cherish her by showcasing her to myself. So if you don't feel like, because some might say, oh, there's nothing I can showcase my spouse about, start by showcasing them to yourself. Now, I think every day is a bit much for a year. People have heard me say this and they just think it's, I'm not clinically OCD, but I live in the neighborhood right next door to it. So when I start to do something, I go overboard. But what about you do it 3 times a week? What if you decide to do it for a month and do it for a Valentine's Day present or something? But it's just creating, you can choose to create a mind that appreciates your wife. It's Philippians 4:8 lived out. Whatever is good, whatever is excellent, whatever is lovely, whatever is true, think about these things.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of cherishing is that we have to win the mind games. I worked with a couple. This was so funny. Married 3 months. She's getting dressed in the morning and they had money. They had a nice walk-in closet. She takes a blouse off the hanger. She puts the hanger back and her husband turns around and he's not seething, but he's holding back. I know you're doing that just to bug me. And she's like, what are you talking about?
Why would I do that?
So putting that naked hanger up there. And she goes, she'd never heard the phrase naked hanger. She had no idea what he was talking about. And he pointed to the corner of his closet where he collected all of his naked hangers. He had this little nudist colony, right? In the master bedroom closet. And what you do, apparently, naked hangers are embarrassed to be around other clothes. So if they're going to be naked, they all need to be naked together. And it looked very organized and whatnot.
Yeah.
She literally had not noticed that that's what he did. She didn't know it was a thing.
Yeah.
And
that's why you were doing it. Yeah.
She was not doing it to make him angry. And she was happy to start doing it if it made him happy. But the mind games are, don't automatically assume your spouse is doing something. The thing that caught my mind on that is one of the things, Philippians 4:8, whatever is true. Every married couple, you and I know this, we've been in it long enough, will have legitimate points of conflict and things we disagree about. Just make sure if you're fighting about something that it's true and it's real. Cherishing means I give my wife the benefit of the doubt until you can't. Because I choose to think about what's true. I choose to think about what's excellent. I choose to think about what's praiseworthy.
Yeah. That, I tell you, it's powerful because you're talking about what that, when I focus on the negative, what that does to my brain. And, confirmation bias means that whatever we believe, we'll find evidence. So if I do get in that negative mindset, then that's what I'm going to notice. And I'm going to ignore all the good. That's what I love about what you're saying. And I think too, that when I choose to be intentional, to think about, what are things that Erin does that I'm grateful for, or that I love about who she is, all of that, that it builds that narrative in my mind that when you're right, when she does something that is frustrating, whether it's the naked hanger or I don't know, whatever, that I think a part of grace is when we choose to see our spouse for who they've been all this time versus for how they're showing up in that moment. But if all you've ever noticed was the negative, then again, there's no grace there because you're like, oh, that's more confirming what I already believe. You're right. That's so powerful. I wanted to read you real quick a little scripture verse, Ephesians 5:25-27. So just in my own, just where God's been kind of taking me with Erin in our marriage. It talks about for husbands, this means to love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. So you talked about the typical love, sacrifice. He gave up his life for her. So again, we get all that. That's the part of the love. To make her holy and clean, washed by the cleansing of God's word. He did this to present her to himself as a glorious church without a spot or wrinkle or any other blemish, instead that she may be holy and without fault. Honestly, as I've read that, I get very quickly that sacrifice, the words in 5:26 and 27 just confused me, like blemish, and so that she stands out. And like nothing really captured me until I really took that to go, okay, I have no idea what that means. Like I'm gonna spend some time, Lord. What did you mean by that? In what is, it's exactly what you're saying, that his bride, the church, he is investing, nourishing, cherishing, building into her, into the state of glory, to unleash her. Because ultimately, as he goes on the cross and goes into heaven, he unleashes the church into this world. In other words, he saw her beauty, all of who she was, her strength, her potential. He nurtured, fed in, invested, all of what you're talking about, cherished her by ultimately then unleashing her. And to me, when you talk about cherish, right, that's the point, is that we cherish as a husband to unleash our wives, right? I mean, I had never seen that. And then it made me feel really stupid. Like, how have I missed that all
That's
these
one of the more
years?
obscure
right?
scriptures. I'm glad you explained
Right.
it. I couldn't have that. But it gives me the picture, and I love this. If you're showcasing your wife,
Yeah.
in heaven, when we're in our glorified state, and people are going to look at Lisa, and they'll look at Aaron, and I want my kids to see, you see this woman who raised you? You see how she is praised, and they're talking about her good works and whatnot, and
Yeah.
my wife was the last born, and so siblings might discount her. She might feel taken for granted by her family or whatnot, but they're going to see her showcased by God himself,
Right.
and they'll see her for all that glory.
And that's
a powerful
we're being called to
picture.
do.
That's what we're
as
called to do,
husbands
to be a
here
part
for
of
that
that.
reason, to unleash.
Yeah.
Because it gives me the chills when I think about who God has created my wife, Erin, to be, all of these strengths and giftings, and to go, boy, cherishing is a part of how I'm investing in her to ultimately go, God, you're going to use her in mighty ways, because I don't want to be, like you said this, is she better off because she married me?
Right.
Or is that like man, I chose wrong. I wish I would have picked old. Like that's such a sweet part of the opportunity that we have. And certainly for our wife, they said the same thing to us. But again, that's between them. So for that, for someone watching this right now going, boof, okay, I get it. Like what's the best way to begin to really cherish our spouse?
Well, I don't want to sound like a shameless huckster, but I mean, that's why I wrote the book.
You do have a book.
Because
That's true.
it really was revolutionary for me to think of that. We've talked about winning, thinking of your spouse as Adam or Eve, the only woman in the world, showcasing your spouse, winning the mind games. That's the Philippians 4:8. I guess a fourth one I would add, if we have the time, is protection. There's something about protecting your spouse that creates cherishing feelings. Let me put this way. If you cherish something, you protect it.
Yeah.
If I have an autograph by Muhammad Ali, I'm not using it as a coaster for my drink. You're putting it in a frame or whatnot.
Right.
Guys that obsessively love their car, they put those very obnoxious covers over the car and everything because they're protecting it. If you cherish someone, you'll protect them. And what do I mean by that?
And by the way, can I just say that I had a signed Muhammad Ali glove that I carefully protected in a plastic bag that pulled the signature off. So I took it out one time to show someone, and I went, and they're like, that's not even signed. And there what the signature was in the plastic bag that I'd put in. So that can backfire, but I don't want to take away from your point.
Went from $500
I tried to protect
to
exactly to zero. Yeah.
I think a powerful example of this is a friend of mine that I made in Houston. We were just getting to know him. We're inviting him over, and Lisa is a very healthy cook. She likes to cook healthy food, and it's got to be organic and preferably
fried.
local. And yeah. And so she had this lamb that she was going to cook. And I always know to call the people ahead of time because not everybody eats that way. And I was shocked because he said, "Oh, Gary, lamb is the one thing I just don't like to eat." And I said, "Well, don't worry. We have chickens that were raised in happy farms and had happy deaths and no stress, and that'll be fine." And so I told Lisa, let's cook chicken. And it just surprised me because he's like a hunter, and he didn't seem to me like a guy who would have a delicate palate.
Turn down any meat.
3 years later, I'm with him at a restaurant and he orders lamb. And I realized by then I'd gotten to know his wife, who has a very particular diet. And he didn't want Lisa to think ill of his wife when they're just getting to know each other. So he took the social bullet. "Hey, it's tough for me. Can you cook something else?" And my respect for him just went, he gets it. Another friend of mine, he's the opposite of me because he's so happy-go-lucky and he doesn't care what anybody thinks about him. And his wife has a real problem with flatulence. I know, the only wife in the world. She's tried the charcoal pellets and everything. She's actually a healthy eater, which is ironic. I don't know if it's all the vegetables or whatnot, but if you have an ear and a nose, you kind of know if you're not. And she's so embarrassed about it. And he doesn't care. So he's just learned whenever that happens, he just says very loudly, my bad. Look, I love those burritos at lunch. I hope you love them as much as I did." And all of their friends think this guy has a real problem with gas. He doesn't. His wife does. But he's happy to take the social bullet for her. He's going to say, "I want to," and she has told me, "Gary, you have no idea what a wife will do for a husband in private when he protects her in public like that." And he would tell me, "Gary, it's a great trade-off." But she feels cherished. He's protecting her in very practical ways. So if you cherish your spouse, you're going to protect. Now, you and I both know, I'm not talking about protecting them from abuse, covering up a crime, criminal things where they need to go to jail or whatnot. I'm just talking about those social situations where it's a thing where you just feel silly or ashamed or embarrassed, but you're not covering up things that need to come out.
I love that.
So shortly after Cherish came out, I've been trying to apply this 3 or 4 years by the time. The book had just come out. I'm speaking at a church. I don't know if you've had this, Greg. The problem is when we speak, we're it. And if you get sick.
Oh, yeah.
And this was a larger church. There were about 1,000 people there.
You're going up on that stage.
There's no backup band, right? And God got me through it, but I was sweating in between. So I'm laying down.
You're taking IV fluids and all kinds of pills.
So that night we're at the hotel, and you know when the fever breaks and it goes to chills? Well, that's what happened to me in the hotel room. And Lisa's next to me, and she starts to put her arms around me. And I'm saying, "Honey, don't. This is awful. I don't want you to catch this." And she goes, "Well, aren't you cold?" I said, "Yeah." And she pulls me closer. "I got to get you warm." Now, that might gross out some of the younger couples, but here's the thing. When a man cherishes his wife, what will she do for his welfare? In my experience, whatever she has to do, because that experience is so unique. It's actually almost selfish for a man to do that in the sense of when she feels taken for granted by her children, neglected by her peers, as she gets older, becoming increasingly invisible. And here's a man who will cherish her.
Yeah.
She's going to hold on to him. She's going to do whatever she can for his welfare. And the same is true for men. When men live in an increasingly competitive world, and they're passed over by the younger, newer guys, or the guys that are more charismatic, or this or that. And yet at home, he's got a woman who cherishes him. It's such a unique experience. He will do for her whatever he has. He will protect her. He will take the social bullet for her. He will be there for her because it's such an amazing experience. You don't want to let it go. So while I chose to start cherishing my wife because I felt convicted by God, it was part of my marital vows, and I believe God wanted me to do that, I found out that doing it was almost self-serving, because I do think it creates a different dynamic in marriage that I'd never want to give up.
Yeah, and I love the illustration between you and Lisa when you when you were chilled and her warming you again, as we talked about, that literally the Greek meaning of the word cherish is to warm. So perfect. Yeah. And again, what you've given is very specific, easy to do things that ultimately helps to cherish, which again is just building that safety and security within the relationship. So always love hanging out. I could do this all day long, just tapping that wisdom that God has given you, and just appreciates just the encouragement. I know that I'm blessed. Aaron is going to be blessed because of your words. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg.
Cool. Got it?
That's perfect. Good on you, buddy. That's chemistry there, calling that out.